Welcome back to Zenith Poker. Today we'll be commencing our series on button versus big blind 3-bet pots. So first off, we'll just have a look at the opening range for the button and the subsequent 3-bet range for the button and the calling range, 3-bet range for the big blind and the calling range for the button. So today we're going to be focusing on this 13.5 big blind 3-bet size. The 3-bet size is relatively large as a proportion of the stack. It's actually the biggest 3-bet size that you'll see for all the formations is going to be the big blind versus button 3-bet size. Against earlier positions, the big blind 3-bet's slightly smaller on average, and obviously the small blind will be 3-betting slightly smaller than the big blind. And because of this large 3-bet size, there's a associated polarity in the 3-bet range. I guess if you consider the value component of this range, looking at it, you've got pocket nines, tens, jacks, queens, kings and aces, the ace king and ace queen component, a little bit of ace jack suited, king queen suited. So if you consider that component of the range as the value component and the remaining hands to be bluffs, the big one here is a very polar 3-bet range. And that's reflected in the 3-bet size. The reason why the big blind has a polar 3-bet range is because that ends up maximizing the amount of value that you get from the calls and all-ins, reduces the stack to pot ratio when you're out of position in the 3-bet pot itself, and basically just growing the pot now pre-flop before anything else changes. And on average, these pocket pairs, these big Broadway hands and these slightly weaker suited Broadway hands in terms of ace jack and king queen do very well against the button calling range, and also do reasonably well against the button 4-betting range as well. Looking here, 13.5. Big blinds is the 3-bet size, and this is the button calling range. Buttons folding pocket twos, partially folding some of these lower pocket pairs, folding some of these suited and connected hands such as 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited, 5-4 suited. These weaker aces are folding at a reasonable frequency. These offsuit hands are folding at a reasonable frequency. This overall sort of continuing range is slightly tighter than the previous one, which we never looked at in terms of the small blind versus button 3-bet pots. And also we start to see the button flatting pocket aces here, which is something that happens when the stack to pot ratio gets very low. Aces starts to become really good as a trap when the stack to pot ratio gets low enough going into the next pot. You'll see in later series, looking at 4-bet pots and stuff, there's a fair amount of trapping in position with pocket aces. But here at this stage, with this 3-bet size of 13.5, you get some traps. If we look at some sort of different 3-bet sizes, slightly smaller, you don't really get anywhere near as many traps, only at 2.76% for aces there for this 12.13. But if you go up to 14.88, you start to trap about half the time. And that's because here the minimum raise here basically allows the button to continue closer to jam or fold, just ripping it in or continuing with hands that have a decent amount of equity against the min 4-bet. And so it's getting the hand a little bit too early, right? So you get 5 bets pre-flop, but potentially by calling, you can get an additional bet both on the flop and then on the turn on the river. So you might even be able to get 6 bets total with pocket aces if you allow for post-flop play with pocket aces. Pocket aces doesn't really get outdrawn very easily, and with the stack to pot ratio being as low as it is, aces will happily get the money in on basically every flop. And if the flop is sufficiently dry, you can just call down 3 bets and basically be able to stack off against a wider range than if it goes for this min 4-bet. Okay, so let's plug some of these ranges into Equilab. So let's go copy range, and we'll look specifically. So that's the wrong setting. Let's go with GTO Plus and higher. Copy that range for the big blind. And we're going to copy the calling range here for the button. Okay. And we'll just have a look at the overall equity, slightly higher for the big blind. What you would expect the big blind to have slightly more equity than the button because they're the pre-flop aggressive. They got all the strong hands, and the button basically will have 4-bet the vast majority of their strong hands pre-flop. And so that leads to that equity edge being slightly better for the big blind. We'll take a look at the overall equity. So this is all the hands in the big blind's range against the hands in the button's range in terms of this heat map. Obviously, the value component you can see pretty clear is these hands with more than 50% equity. But out of position, you could say that a value hand needs to have even more than that to be clearly a value hand. So pocket nines, tens, jacks, queens, pretty obvious. These big pocket pairs are value component. Ace king and ace queen, fairly clearly a value component. Pocket eights, ace jack suited, king queen suited, they're a little bit in between. King queen suited does really well in the 4-bet, so in the 3-bet pot, because the button always 4-bets ace king. Looking back at the preflop range, this is the button's continuing range here. All this ace king is going into the 4-bet, and a little bit of the ace queen is going to the 4-bet. So because the button 4-bets all that ace king, this king queen suited becomes a value hand against the calling range for the button, right? Because it's less likely to be dominated. Sure, it is still dominated by the ace queen, and there is a lot of ace queen in the button's range. But when there's a king, but when there's a king on the board, say king high board, king queen suited is basically nuts. It's as strong as ace king essentially on these king high boards, or when there's a king on the board. It's basically as strong as king queen is, even though it does get dominated by that ace queen. Very strong when there's a king high board. When there's a queen high board, it does have to be a little bit wary of running into ace queen. Okay, what else can we see? There's a lot of other hands in the 3-bet range, in contrast to the small blind range, which was pretty merged, and basically all the hands are very similar in terms of strength. The big blind is 3-betting a very polar range, right? So the big blind's got these suited connectors being thrown in there, some of these suited gap hands, some of these offsuit connected and gap hands, some of these offsuit broadways, suited aces, suited kings, even some offsuit aces being thrown in at a reasonable frequency. And a lot of these hands will most likely just make a decent pair, say for example top pair with a weak kicker, say a second or third pair with their second card in terms of these ace x and king x hands. And then you shouldn't play accordingly. The stack to bar ratio there is pretty low, so you don't really have to be too worried about getting too outdrawn. In the heads up pot, out of position, these suited and connected hands do pretty well in terms of getting additional board coverage for certain board types, which we will see later on. That because of the overall polarity of this range, very Broadway heavy, very big pocket pair heavy, having these suited connectors in the range works well in terms of covering these sort of lower and middling boards, and the EV of these particular hands just goes through the roof on those sort of boards, because those boards themselves are actually pretty good for the button calling range. So let's have a look at the button calling range. Very, very pocket pair heavy, sort of these 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, very heavy in these pocket pairs. Not so many suited connected hands. It's somewhat of a mistake to be calling too many of the suited connected hands, mainly because these suited connected hands actually start to block a lot of the bluffing hands, and they don't draw too well when the stack pot ratio gets really low. In contrast to out of position, you can use it as a 3-bet bluff and then give up if you miss, or if you make a decent draw, you can basically keep betting. Here in position, they will have difficulty defending against some of the stronger Broadway type hands that the big blind is using. So very pocket pair heavy, but also very suited Broadway heavy. So a lot of these suited Broadways and suited 9s, ace queen offsuit, king queen offsuit, ace jack offsuit, similar to what was in the buttons calling range against the small blind 3-bet. Very low frequency is king jack, ace 10, king 10, and some of these suited aces doing a little bit better against this polar 3-bet range than you might expect, right? Flopping top pair against, if you've got something like S7, you flop top pair, it's going to be difficult for your opponent's king 10 or something to outdraw you, because they'll need to basically draw to runner to outdraw you, and you end up blocking some stuff, like you end up blocking a bit of aces, blocking a bit of ace king, ace queen type hands when you've got a suited ace. Okay, and obviously these hands will have about 30% equity against a hand like kings, queens, jacks, which is going to be the bulk of the big blind 3-bet range. So having suited ace is nice because you can outdraw some stuff. And then when the stack to bar ratio gets pretty low, even though there's an ace on the board and you're worrying about ace king because you don't have any ace king, it is important to have decent coverage when there is an ace on the board. So just some comparison: ace 8, ace 7, ace 6, right? Not really being taken in the button versus small blind, right? But if you have button versus big blind, you have more ace 7 being taken as the call, and less of the suited connectors, right? And that's what you can see for the lower stack to pot ratio in terms of this facing this bigger 3-bet. It's better to be continuing with an ace or a king rather than low suited connector. Better to have these sort of Broadway hands because they're more likely to outdraw some of the pocket pairs and will basically be ahead of a lot of these bluffs. All right, while we're here, we'll look at just a slight continuation against the overall 4-bet. Facing min 4-bet, the big blind will be basically continuing with a lot of their suited hands which made the 3-bet. It's a very small 4-bet. Facing a 4-bet slightly bigger, you can fold a lot of these suited hands. And this is also where some of these suited connected hands do really well. They do reasonably well when facing a 4-bet just because they can draw to a decent draw and then stack off accordingly. Even though the for calling sort of these hands is relatively low, it is still plus EV to be continuing, and then you end up getting sufficient calling range against the min 4-bet. Aces trapping that out of position. The hands which just rip it in was ace king and these bigger pocket pairs. Basically, the value component of the 3-bet range becomes the 4-bet jamming range with the exception of aces and so to a lesser degree 10s, 9s. And then you have some additional bluffing hands being thrown in there, such as the king queen suited, ace 4, ace 5, ace 3, ace 2. Rip it in, and the button having a polar 4-bet range will basically just continue with the value component of that 4-bet range, which is the 10s plus an ace queen. Even though 10s here doesn't really go for that min 4-bet at a very high frequency, choosing to jam more often, some of the ace king offsuit, ace queen offsuit jamming instead of going for the min 4-bet. Looking at some other sort of lines, if the big blind 3-bet's a little bit smaller, right, we see that the aces is being a 4-bet at a full frequency instead. And all these suited aces are basically continuing, with the exception of ace 2 suited, which sometimes folds, but mostly goes for the 4-bet. A lot of these suited broadways are continuing well in position, and the suited connectors, as we can see when the stack pot ratio gets shorter, they just don't play as well. So they're being folded out. And also they block potential bluff candidates in the buttons range. So in the big blind's range. Looking here, big blind itself is going to be wanting to be 3-betting a bunch of these hands, ace 7, ace 6, ace 5, king 6, 10 6, jack 7. So when facing the 3-bet, even though these hands will have a decent amount of equity against sort of Broadway type hands, they will be dominated by the bluffing component of the big blind's range, which is not really a component in the small blind's range because the small blind needs to be much more merged, right? And here and then small blind 3-bet and then big blind folds. These aces, they're folding, right? But these suited connectors are continuing more often, right? So why is that difference? Why is there this difference between the continuing range against the big blind range, against the big blind 3-bet compared to the small blind 3-bet? It's because of the hands that make up the bluffing component of these ranges. These suited connected hands don't get dominated by as many potential bluffs in the small blind's range. They do get dominated by and block potential bluffs in the big blind's range. On the other hand, a lot of these suited aces, right, will do very well against the bluffing component of the big blind's range, right? These suited aces will be able to end up dominating some of these weaker jack 7, 10 7, jack 6. So you end up being ahead of the bluffs, even though you do slightly block them, but you also block a lot of this ace X component. So when you're facing these small 3-bet continuing with all these suited aces against the big blind is better because the big blind is relatively polar and they don't have as much big ace X compared to the small blind's range. They've got a lot of ace jack offsuit and ace 10 offsuit, which is not a big feature of the big blind's 3-bet range, right? Looking here at the ace 10 offsuit, calling almost 90% of the time, ace jack offsuit calling about half the time, right? So there's not as much big ace X in the big blind's 3-bet range. So when you've got a suited ace, you've got a lot of equity against a pocket pair, right? You end up dominating some bluffs. And so you can continue at a higher frequency against the big blind than you could against the small blind. On the other hand, when you've got a suited and connected hand, suited connector, you end up blocking bluffs and you end up dominated by bluffs, which you're not in the small blind's range. And those suited connectors do a lot better against those big offsuit Broadway hands in the small blind's range here. Right, the suited connectors do well against this component. here, which is the main bluffing component in the small blinds range. But they do poorly against these type of hands and the other set connectors, right? They do poorly against sort of Jack 7, 10 7, Jack 6, King 6, because they get dominated. Okay, that's a bit of an overview of the pre-flop strategy for both players in the big blind versus button configuration. And in the next few videos, I think we'll be starting off by looking at the connected boards, starting off with connected low and then moving up to connected mid and connected high, and then we'll go from there. So I hope to see you in those next videos, and I hope you learned something from this video, and I'll see you all later. Bye now.